The psychological function is transcendent because it results from the union of conscious and unconscious contents. There comes a moment in every woman's life when the noise of the world stops making sense. When the things that once impressed her begin to feel small, and the life she built with so much effort suddenly feels like a borrowed costume. Too tight, too shallow, too silent. She looks around and everything appears the same, but something invisible inside her has begun to move. It's not ambition. It's not another goal to chase. It's a quiet ache that whispers, there must be more. Not more success, not more approval, but more life, more truth, more soul. You can't see this shift from the outside. It's subtle, almost imperceptible. She still smiles at the same people, still performs the same routines, but her eyes start to look somewhere else, beyond. It's as if an ancient memory is awakening in her bones, reminding her that she came here for something deeper than survival, something eternal. The old identity she wore like armor begins to crack, not because she's failing, but because she's finally ready to breathe without it. There is a sacred restlessness that comes before transformation. It feels like a breaking, but it's really a birth. Jung once wrote, "The meeting with the self is the beginning of individuation." And that meeting begins right here, when the masks fall and the soul begins to speak. It's the point where performance ends and presence begins. At first, it feels like dying. You mourn the version of you who once believed that being loved meant being small. You grieve the safety of belonging in places that required you to betray yourself. But this grief is holy. It is the death of illusion. The awakening woman learns that every loss she feared was actually a liberation in disguise. She starts to see meaning where others see chaos. The silence that once frightened her now feels like a friend. The emptiness that once felt unbearable now becomes a doorway. Because she's beginning to sense what Jung called the autonomy of the unconscious, that mysterious intelligence within her that has been guiding her all along. Life was never random. It was communicating through symbols, pain, and coincidence. Every heartbreak, every delay, every unanswered prayer was a message from the self, patiently waiting for her to listen. And when she finally does, when she stops running from herself, the real journey begins. Not the journey of seeking light somewhere in the sky, but of descending into her own depths. For true awakening is not an escape from darkness. It's the courage to face it without fear. Roots grow before flowers bloom. The woman who rises does not abandon the soil. She becomes one with it. Her wounds become seeds, and her silence becomes a sanctuary where God still whispers. She no longer wants to be seen. She wants to see. She no longer craves validation. She craves truth. And as she surrenders to that invisible pull, something ancient inside her begins to stir, like dawn breaking quietly over the ruins of who she used to be. She doesn't yet know where this path will lead, only that she can't go back. Because once the soul has tasted truth, pretending feels like suffocation. And now, standing at the threshold between who she was and who she's becoming, she feels the sacred question echo through every corner of her being. What exactly is awakening inside her? Underneath the calm surface of her transformation, something deeper is taking shape. It's not just an emotional awakening. It's an ancient psychological event that Carl Jung spent his life trying to map. He discovered that within every soul lives a polarity, the masculine and the feminine, forever seeking reunion. Within every man lives a hidden feminine, the anima, the bridge to emotion, intuition, and empathy. And within every woman lies a hidden masculine, the animus, the principle of inner strength, clarity, and will. For centuries, culture taught her to silence that side, to please rather than act, to feel rather than to know. But when she begins to awaken, the animus rises from the depths of her unconscious, like a forgotten king returning from exile. At first, it feels unsettling. She begins to speak with a new tone, calm but unshakable. The same mouth that once whispered apologies now pronounces truth. Her words no longer tremble because they come from the center of her being. Jung called this process the integration of opposites, the sacred marriage between heart and reason, intuition and intellect. In this union, the feminine does not disappear, it expands. The mind no longer tries to dominate the heart. It learns to serve it, and that single reversal changes everything. She begins to see her sensitivity not as fragility, but as refined perception. Her compassion no longer drains her. It sharpens her discernment. Where she once said yes to avoid rejection, she now says no to protect her peace. The boundaries she once feared setting become acts of love. Her empathy becomes intelligence. The same tears that once made her feel weak now baptize her courage. She understands that grace and power were never opposites. They were two sides of the same soul learning to move in harmony. In Jung's language, this is the moment the anima, the inner feminine of humanity, becomes conscious through her. When a woman integrates her masculine aspect, she doesn't become harder, she becomes whole. The energy that once turned inward as anxiety begins to flow outward as clarity. Her intuition stops fighting her logic. Instead, it becomes its compass. She realizes she can be soft without surrendering her strength and strong without abandoning her tenderness. This is the real alchemy of awakening, turning opposites into unity. But the world rarely welcomes a woman like this. Society praises independence until it meets a woman who doesn't need validation. It celebrates kindness until that kindness comes with self-respect. People who once admired her warmth may now call her distant. Those who loved her compliance may call her cold. Yet what they're really seeing is their own discomfort with authenticity. For centuries, the world feared women who could think, feel, and choose all at once, because such women cannot be controlled. Still, she does not harden her heart. She deepens it. She no longer fights for approval because she's found something more precious than acceptance, alignment. Her truth no longer needs to be believed by others to remain true. And this realization, though liberating, can also be lonely. For when the animus awakens, it doesn't only bring clarity, it brings confrontation. Her light starts to expose shadows, both in herself and in the world around her. She begins to notice the subtle manipulations she once ignored, the games of power disguised as love, the systems built to keep her doubting her own intuition. The awakening woman does not wage war against the world. She simply refuses to betray herself anymore. That quiet refusal is her revolution, and through it, the collective feminine begins to remember its true face. Not submissive, not superior, but sovereign. Jung once wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And for a woman, that privilege requires courage to meet the masculine within her, to balance fire with grace, to be both anchor and wind. This is what it means to become conscious of the anima, to embody love that thinks, wisdom that feels, strength that heals. But consciousness comes with a cost. For the moment she begins to live by the truth within, the world around her starts to shift. Old patterns break, relationships change, illusions dissolve. The same fire that lights her path also burns away everything false. And as her inner power rises to meet a world still ruled by fear and projection, the sacred tension begins to grow. Because what happens when this awakened force meets a world that still trembles before women who see clearly? That's where the real conflict begins. When the soul begins to awaken, it doesn't rise into light immediately. It stirs the darkness first. The moment a woman starts seeing through the illusion she once called truth, the unseen forces within her start to resist. Jung called this the confrontation with the shadow, the hidden part of the psyche that contains everything we repress, deny, or fear. At first, it doesn't appear as a monster. It comes disguised as hesitation, guilt, exhaustion. It sounds like a voice that whispers, "Who do you think you are to change?" The shadow isn't evil. It's the unlived life, waiting to be seen. But its first instinct is to fight back, because awakening threatens its rule. Suddenly, everything she once tolerated begins to feel unbearable. Conversations drain her. Roles that once gave her identity now feel like chains. She feels torn between keeping the peace and keeping her soul intact. That's the invisible battle. The pull between the self she built to survive and the self that's trying to be born. The mind says, stay safe. The soul says, be real. And between these two voices, she feels stretched to the breaking point. Jung wrote, "No one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The light is not an escape. It's the courage to look directly into what hurts. As her awareness grows, so does the shadow's resistance. It projects itself through doubt, maybe I'm overreacting. Through guilt, maybe I'm being selfish. Through fear, maybe they'll leave me if I change. These emotions are not mistakes. They're messages. The psyche is reorganizing itself, breaking attachments to the patterns that once kept her small. Yet the world around her doesn't make it easy. The collective unconscious, society's shadow, tries to pull her back into what's comfortable, acceptable, controllable. It rewards obedience and punishes authenticity. It whispers, don't stand out, don't speak too loud, don't make others uncomfortable. But her silence now costs more than her approval ever did. This is where the awakening becomes dangerous. Not because she's wrong, but because she's shedding identities faster than the world can understand. She starts to see the subtle contracts she made with pain. The way she stayed quiet to be loved. The way she dimmed her brilliance to be safe. The way she called endurance virtue when it was really fear. The shadow lives in those compromises. It thrives in the parts of her that still believe she must earn love by shrinking. And as she begins to expose those lies, life tests her resolve. People may withdraw. Opportunities may vanish. The outer world mirrors the inner storm. But this chaos has a purpose. The shadow doesn't come to destroy her. It comes to reveal her strength. When she learns to sit with her darkness, to name it without shame, it loses its power to control her. The fear becomes a compass pointing toward what still needs healing. The guilt transforms into discernment. Even her anger becomes sacred fire, burning through false peace. What once felt like punishment now becomes purification. And yet, most people never make it this far. The moment the shadow rises, they turn back to comfort, to busyness, distraction, control. They confuse numbness with peace. But the woman who continues, who dares to face her own night, begins to understand that her shadow is not her enemy. It's her teacher. It carries the pieces of her soul that she abandoned to be accepted. To reject it again would be to reject herself. Still, the deeper she goes, the more cunning the shadow becomes. It starts hiding behind spirituality, disguising avoidance as serenity, superiority as wisdom. It tells her she's above anger or desire, when in truth she's just afraid to feel. That's the trick of the unconscious, to wear masks even in the light. And so the battle turns inward once more, into subtle realms of humility and truth. Because if she refuses to meet her own darkness with compassion, it will rule her from behind the curtain. Every unhealed part will find a way to speak, through projection, jealousy, or fear of being seen. The only way to master the shadow is to love it back into wholeness. And that's where the true danger lives, not in the darkness itself, but in denying it. Because what we refuse to face begins to control us. Denying the call of the soul is like pressing your hand over a flower just as it's about to bloom. Life keeps moving, but something sacred inside you stops breathing. You go through the motions, work, conversations, routines. Yet everything feels slightly hollow, like living in a world drained of color. You smile, but the smile doesn't reach your eyes. You rest, but you never feel rested. That's the first sign of spiritual denial. You're functioning but not flourishing. You've silenced a part of you that carries the pulse of meaning, and the soul does not vanish when ignored. It withdraws, waiting in silence for you to notice its absence. Jung warned that what we resist persists. When the inner voice is dismissed long enough, it doesn't disappear. It turns into symptoms. The psyche finds other ways to speak, through fatigue, anxiety, illness, or sudden bursts of emotion that seem to come from nowhere. You start waking up in the middle of the night with a weight in your chest. You lose interest in the things that once defined you. The body begins to mirror the soul's exhaustion. This isn't weakness, it's communication. The unconscious is sending signals, saying, I am still here, listen. A woman who denies her intuition doesn't lose it. She drowns it in noise. She fills her days with tasks, her heart with worry, her mind with distraction. But at night, when the defenses drop, the soul sneaks through her dreams. Jung believed that dreams are letters from the unconscious, written in the language of symbols. A locked door, a vast ocean, a winding path. These are not random images. They're messages from within, showing her where she's afraid to go and what part of her longs to return. When she dreams of water, the psyche is asking for cleansing. When she sees mirrors, the self is asking her to look deeper. When she finds herself walking down endless roads, it's her destiny whispering, "Come back to me." Ignoring these signs comes at a cost. The energy that once flowed freely begins to dry up. Creativity fades, relationships feel stale, and life becomes mechanical. She may call it burnout, but beneath the exhaustion lies something more profound, the grief of an unlived life. Jung once said that neurosis is often the result of the soul that hasn't found its meaning. The woman who denies her soul's voice ends up living in fragments, always seeking externally what she already carries within. And the more she resists, the louder the unconscious becomes, pushing her through crisis, heartbreak, or loss until she finally remembers who she is. This is why pain can be sacred. It is the psyche's alarm, the soul's rebellion against a life too small for its truth. Every breakdown contains an invitation. Return. Return to the wild intuition you once silenced. Return to the body you abandoned when you started performing strength. Return to the softness you were told was weakness. The flowers of the spirit only bloom again when they are watered with honesty. But there is hope, immense hope, because the same unconscious that punishes forgetfulness also holds a medicine for remembering. Beneath the chaos lives a precise intelligence, a hidden map that Jung devoted his life to revealing. It's the path of individuation, the process of becoming whole again. This is not a journey of perfection, but of reconciliation, of gathering every lost part of yourself and bringing it back into light. And that map, that sacred return to wholeness, always begins in the same place. The hardest place of all. True transformation never happens by running away from pain. It begins the moment you turn toward it with open eyes. Jung understood this deeply. He called it the transcendent function, the sacred point where opposites within us finally meet. It's not an idea but an experience, the place where the conscious and the unconscious stop fighting and begin to speak to each other. Healing, then, is not about escaping darkness or chasing constant light. It's about creating a bridge between both. You don't destroy the old self. You reconcile with it. You don't erase your wounds. You learn to listen to what they've been trying to say. This is the map Jung left us, the path of integration. Step 1, recognize. Begin by admitting what hurts. Not intellectually, but honestly. Stop spiritualizing the ache. Name it. Feel it in your body. Pain that is denied becomes fate. Pain that is faced becomes transformation. Recognition is the act of saying to your own soul, "I see you." Step 2, welcome. Let the unconscious speak in its own language, through dreams, through symbols, through art, through silence. When you draw without judgment, when you sit quietly and let an image rise from the depths, the soul begins to reveal what the mind has forgotten. Jung believed that the unconscious compensates for the imbalance of the ego. That means what you ignore by day will visit you by night, not to punish you, but to complete you. Step 3, integrate. Insight means nothing if it stays theoretical. Integration is action born from awareness. It's saying no when you mean no, resting when you're tired, walking away when your peace is at stake. It's living according to the truth that was revealed to you, even when no one else understands it. This is a crucible of authenticity, when your outer life begins to match your inner knowing. Step 4, live consciously. To live consciously is to remember who you are while standing in the noise of the world. It's refusing to shrink or apologize for existing in your full expression. It's loving without losing yourself, serving without self-erasure, being soft without collapsing. When you live this way, you no longer react from wounds. You respond from wisdom. At this stage, life becomes less about control and more about cooperation with something larger. What Jung called a self, the organizing principle of the psyche. The self doesn't demand perfection. It asks for honesty. It guides through synchronicities, subtle nudges, meaningful coincidences that confirm you are walking your path. Every time you act from awareness rather than fear, you strengthen that connection. Every time you choose truth over comfort, the bridge between your conscious mind and your soul becomes stronger. But before the full transformation takes root, the psyche will test your growth. You'll be tempted to abandon the process, to rush ahead, to seek external validation, to claim enlightenment before it's real. These are the traps of the ego dressed as progress. The moment you think you've arrived, the unconscious will humble you again, reminding you that integration is a lifelong dialogue, not a single event. The transcendent function isn't a destination, it's a rhythm, a sacred conversation between what you know and what you don't, between who you were and who you're becoming. And in learning to hold that tension with grace, you discover what Jung meant when he said that wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the contraries. Still, even with this map, there are subtle forces that can pull you back into the old patterns, illusions that look like growth but are really resistance in disguise. And it's those hidden traps we need to face next. Every awakening carries a hidden test. The moment when the ego, terrified of losing control, puts on spiritual clothing and declares itself enlightened. It happens quietly, almost beautifully. One day you catch yourself thinking, "I'm not like them anymore. I've outgrown all that." The words sound empowered, but beneath them is pride dressed as evolution. Jung called this the inflation of the ego, when the conscious self identifies with the self and mistakes proximity to light for being the light itself. It's one of the most seductive traps on the path of individuation because it feels so right. You mistake insight for transformation, knowledge for embodiment, awakening for arrival. The spiritualized ego loves to perform growth. It speaks in perfect affirmations, posts word of wisdom, builds an identity around healing. But deep down, it's terrified of being ordinary, of being wrong, of being human again. It wants to stay above the mess of life, to float where nothing can touch it. Yet Jung warned that the moment you believe yourself divine, you've fallen out of relationship with the divine. The self isn't something you become, it's something you serve. Real consciousness humbles you. It doesn't crown you, it dismantles you. Then comes the next illusion, isolation. After awakening, solitude feels sacred. But if you stay too long in that stillness, it can harden into loneliness. You start to believe no one can understand you anymore. That connection is a distraction, that relationships are obstacles to peace. But consciousness without connection becomes sterile. The purpose of individuation isn't to escape humanity, it's to embody divinity within humanity. The lotus blooms in mud, not above it. You were never meant to live untouched by the world, but to walk through it awake. Another trap waits in the opposite direction, the savior complex. The newly awakened self wants to help, to heal, to fix everyone. It sees others' pain and forgets that compassion without boundaries is self-abandonment. You can hold space for someone, but you cannot walk their path for them. Trying to save others before saving yourself only recreates the same imbalance you were trying to escape. Jung saw this pattern as the ego's last offense. It shifts attention outward to avoid the final confrontation inward. True service begins when you no longer need to be the rescuer, when your presence, not your effort, becomes healing. Through all these stages, the ego keeps whispering subtle lies. You're almost done. You've transcended. You're special now. But the deeper truth is quieter. The more conscious you become, the less you need to announce it. Real awakening isn't loud. It doesn't demand followers or validation. It moves through you like wind through leaves, invisible yet unmistakably alive. The awakened woman doesn't glow to be seen. She glows because she has nothing left to hide. Her peace becomes her proof. And this is the paradox. As her awareness expands, she becomes softer, not harder, humbler, not higher. She starts to laugh at her own seriousness, to see divinity in the ordinary, in spilled coffee, in a stranger's kindness, in her own mistakes. That's when the ego finally bows, realizing it was never the author of her transformation. It was only the soil that cracked open for the flower to grow. Because the true ascent is not a performance. It's a quiet return. The woman who overcomes these illusions doesn't rise above the world. She walks through it, light in her eyes, peace in her breath, love in her hands. And when she finally transcends even the need to be awakened, something sacred begins to unfold. There comes a moment when the fire no longer burns. It purifies, when everything that once felt like loss begins to shimmer with meaning. The woman who dared to walk through her own darkness, who faced her shadows instead of escaping them, no longer reacts to the world. She responds from the stillness of her center. Life stops being something that happens to her and becomes something that flows through her. The same storms that once shattered her now water her roots. She no longer asks, "Why me?" but whispers, "Thank you," because now she understands. Every crack was a doorway, every ending a disguised beginning. She used to orbit around the expectations of others, a satellite of borrowed identities. But awakening has turned her into a sun, not one that blinds, but one that warms. Her peace no longer depends on external approval. It radiates from within. Perfection has lost its allure. Integration has taken its place. Jung taught that the real journey of the soul is not about becoming flawless, but about becoming whole. She finally sees that wholeness includes her contradictions, her tenderness and her rage, her doubt and her faith, her strength and her softness, all held in sacred harmony. Now, in the quiet spaces where she once felt empty, she begins to hear something new, the rhythm of divine timing. She no longer rushes. She trusts. She knows that even in stillness, growth is happening beneath the surface. The same life that breathes through galaxies is breathing through her. Jung wrote in The Man and His Symbols, "Man becomes whole only when he unites his conscious and unconscious." That's not a metaphor. It's a moment the inner and outer worlds shake hands. Heaven and earth meet inside her. She realizes that awakening was never about escaping life, but about inhabiting it fully. Tears and laughter, light and shadow, the sacred woven to the ordinary. The woman who once searched for herself in others now finds God in the mirror. She no longer needs signs. She has become one. When she prays, her prayer is presence. When she acts, her action is love. This is what it means to be awake. Not to stand above the world, but to move through it with grace, grounded and radiant at once. Her roots sink deeper even as her light grows brighter. And in that balance, she discovers peace that no storm can take away. She doesn't ascend into heaven. She brings heaven here. She is no longer divided between who she was and who she's becoming. She is both, and she is free. The circle closes, not in triumph, but in quiet awe. The woman who once feared her own depth now calls it home. The awakened woman doesn't rise. She roots herself in light. Comment below, "I choose to grow even when it hurts." And watch the next video. Your journey continues.